what does the postseason look like differently than the regular season did? Specifically, like how do you look to find alpha? Is there as much alpha? Like what is the, because obviously like what if you infer everything that you said, everything that you do, and this will be obvious to every smart gambler, so but maybe to not the casual bettor. Everything that you talk about is relative to market. The reason that you like the Warrior, like the reason that you are anti Boston this year is just because of one, the competition, but also just their perception of the market. They are now seen as this, this team that is priced unfairly in your mind, and therefore there's opportunities. How do you think? What do you think about in the world of getting alpha against the market in the postseason? There's obvious things that are well known or well documented in the market is shaped, but like where give me some alpha tricks that you think about in the postseason.
Yeah, so betting the NBA playoffs is honestly entirely different than the regular season. The regular season is very repetitive. It's just kind of you do your thing, market opens at whatever 6 o'clock. You see what you like, wait till whenever you bet, get your bets in. The playoffs, a lot more competition is in the market, and I think that's good and bad. So I found that when when a line opens, maybe the first 30 minutes, the line will be like pretty bad and it'll get hit to kind of roughly where it'll go. And then the number will bounce around. And if you think you have an edge on a team, you can. I think this advice is typically really bad for gamblers, but in the NBA playoffs, it's actually pretty good. You can wait, and one of the major sites or one of the exchanges will take steam, and you can get pretty much a really, really good off market number for a lot of liquidity in the NBA playoffs. So you can get really good pricing because of how many different opinions and how much money is in the market, especially considering a lot of the times there's 2 days between games. So there's a lot of time to get down on this stuff. And then the big difference is in terms of actual like team quality is you'll see things like, playoff. I don't know if it's quite as basic as playoff experience, but there are teams that the market thinks are better in the playoffs than the regular season. So that's something you really have to adjust for. And then there's the zigzag where, if you're down 2-0 going home, you're getting a massive price boost for the zigzag effect.
Is and the zigzag effect is even somewhat derivatives get priced even more poorly or more aggressively based on zigzag, right? Like first quarters or first halves and things like that.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say they get priced more poorly, but it's an even more um, extreme shift of like the first half for an 0-2 game or a team down 0-2 going home. So I'd say where you get alpha in terms of zigzag is these things are really not all like you can have historical data of what happens when a team is down 3-0. But if the Cavs go down 3-0 in this series to Indiana, that is entirely different than if Orlando goes down 3-0 to Boston. The Cavs have this unique circumstance of a lot of players injured. They could be getting players back, but also they're not going to have, that deflation effect of, oh, this series is over. I think a team like the Cavs or a team like Boston would go into a 3-0 series not thinking this series is over versus Orlando going into a series against Boston where, they're 10-point dogs, every game 11-point dogs, going into that 3-0 game. It's just a completely different mindset, and that stuff really does matter. So I think where you want to generate alpha is understanding the uniqueness of, what a zigzag is. Another spot I would say is a really good place to get alpha in NBA playoffs is you can go one game where a player plays 25 minutes and then the next game they can play 3. So you can be, or the opposite of a player plays 3 minutes and plays 30. And these books have pretty deep lists of who they're offering. So if you can get that right of who is in the coach's favor at this point, you can get a lot down on an NBA player prop, and there can be really big edges if you find it and do it right.
Can we talk a little bit about why the zigzag effect exists and basically how strong it has been historically and like what our sample size is like? Because if I think about trying to, if I were modeling this, you know, I would feel like the truth is probably somewhere between what we've actually seen, because given that, you it's you will find sort of extreme effects in one way or another in small sample sizes, that you can create a narrative around. Uh, but clearly there is something to this. But is it as extreme as it has shown in what is, I don't know how big a sample. I don't know how many years you go back to look at that. But have you explored the data?
Yeah, well, if you think about it, there's been, how many series are there a year in the NBA playoffs? You go back 30 years, there's a lot of, testing of zigzag effect, especially considering you get some piece of information every game, like there's a zigzag on 1-0, there's a zigzag on 1-1. Like every game, you do get some piece of information. Obviously, it's not perfect information and each scenario is different. But I do think there's some logic to, you know, or it's just kind of sensible. If you're down 0-2, you're probably going to play your star players more than the other team. You're probably going to be willing to make really aggressive adjustments that the other coach is maybe going to wait to go later in the series to see if they have to go those adjustments. They're willing to go later in the series to, up their star players' minutes because they're thinking about, game 7, they're thinking about the next round. And then I think there's some ref effects. I think there's some just kind of human nature of desperation, especially if you're at home, you get like an even more raucous home crowd. So I think it's not really one thing, it's a lot of things combined. But I think a lot of them are just logical of, the team's going to play their best guys more and they're going to play a bit harder and the coaching staff is going to be a bit more aggressive.
And how big, wait, can I, like, how big is the effect overall in terms of points per game?
That's just a bit too broad of a question. But, if you look at the Warriors series, Houston played Golden State game 1 in Houston, I think closed, maybe 1.5 point favorites. And then in game 2 were 4 point favorites, same game after a loss. So it can be a lot of points.
Is it? I mean, because I'm just sort of thinking about it from a Bayesian perspective, and where yes, I think there clearly is a sizable impact, but I would assume that the impact isn't as big, or I wouldn't predict that it is going to be as big moving forward as it has been in the past, because we're kind of biased because we've seen this effect. There are all sorts of effects that could have shown up in the data, and this is the one that did. It was extreme enough that people noticed. It affected the market. But there is also, I guess my point is, I feel like there's got to be some level of randomness to it also. I mean, just the idea of regression to the mean, like the most extreme things effects you see are more likely to be somewhat a product of noise and luck as well.
Yeah, I think it's possible, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. Also, anyone can kind of have this opinion against zigzag, and if you wanted to, go in late on an NBA game, you could get 7 figures pretty easily. So I typically trust the market with stuff like that. It's possible that it's getting priced at a regress number as well. I don't really see that. Yeah, I honestly don't really see that. I think, again, it is really situational of, Golden State, Houston game 5. I keep going back to their series. I think they had kind of the most extreme zigzags. But like Steve Kerr has been a coach who's been quite willing to punt games when they feel like they're in a really advantaged spot in the series. The same thing happened in 2022 against Memphis. So, that's a spot where they're up 3-1. The zigzag will be more extreme. So I do think
Draymond said in that press conference, like game 5 doesn't matter, right? After game 4, he basically said game 5 doesn't matter. Like that one was it was fascinating to watch the impact of that. And I guess that's kind of what you're saying with understanding the real effect versus what the market really thinks it is.
Yeah, I think the market, my typical baseline is, especially in these big markets, is the market will get it right by close, but it won't get it right at open or in the middle when things are very particular. And sometimes it'll get it wrong at close as well. So that's where I think you would find the most, alpha, and the most times where zigzag isn't priced correctly over the course of open to close. But I typically lean to where it closes, and that's typically correct.
What's the biggest thing you've learned in NBA handicapping in the last year from when we last had you on? Is there any sort of big lesson you've learned in that time, or big improvement that you've made?
I would say we've really, in terms of playoffs, have really focused in on all the things we've been talking about. I would say regular season this year and last year, there was no like huge changes to our process, but I would say betting in the playoffs has always been our weakest point. Like that's where we would kind of have stuff played against us. That's where we would find we were getting the least amount of CLV, versus now we've really dialed in on all the stuff we talked about. Zigzag specifically, how are we going to adjust for, the more veteran teams or the teams we think the market are going to upgrade? Because I think last year, the perfect example is Phoenix, Minnesota. We had Minnesota priced better than Phoenix like the whole year. And then it came out and Phoenix was a big favorite with Minnesota at home. We were like, this is the best bet ever. Minnesota, to be fair, did sweep, but we were just shocked by those prices. So now we've learned, you have to adjust playoff. Like, what do we think this team is as a playoff team when they're really going to up the minutes for their best players? And I do think the market just has respect for certain styles of play and certain types of players in the playoffs.
Thanks.
And do you think the market's right on that, or do you think that the market over adjusts to that?
I'm a CLV truther. I think the market's right about just about everything.
Bet the process.